Greetings, Corpse Clubbers, and welcome to another episode of Corpse Club, your official podcast for DailyDead.com. My name is Heather Wixson, and for this week's episode, we are kicking off our Class of 1980 series with an episode where we're going to dive into Ken Russell's Altered States. And for this week, I am joined by Bryan Christopher and Monte Yazzie. Thank you guys for joining me for this, I'm sure to be mind-bending discussion of a completely weird little movie that I I'm sort of addicted to now.
Yeah, I'm there with you. We were talking a little bit before we started recording. I hadn't seen this in probably about 25 years, something like that. I saw it maybe once when I was like 10 years old. Quarantine brain kicking in.
I'm still 10 o'clock.
When I was 10 years old, and boy, is that not a movie that a 10-year-old is probably going to comprehend or really get into. So honestly, I remember like two things from that movie. I remember the scene where he like turns into a caveman and he's running down the streets of Boston. And then I remember the ending, of course, partially because it keeps coming back up with like, apparently like Aha's Take on Me is a riff on that. So it's just kind of one of those iconic things that if people are going to remember it, they remember that. It was really nice being able to see it again and see it in a context where I could actually comprehend what was going on. And I actually really, really enjoyed it.
Excellent. I'm glad you mentioned Take on Me, because we're going to talk about some of the influences of this. I think it's interesting to me watching it now as an adult because I see how this movie went on to sort of influence a lot of other things. But I'm glad you mentioned Aha, because I think that's really, really a fun reference. Monty, was this a first time watch for you, or had you seen it before?
No, I actually saw this when I was a young kid and didn't really understand what the themes were in the movie. But when I was in college, I had a developmental psychology teacher who was also quite a big cinephile. And he recommended this class or this movie to the class as like a, extra credit discussion thing. And I remember having to like go to what's that place called? Used to be the Warehouse, and finding a VHS of it. And I remembered it vaguely, but putting it on again and watching it now, everything came flooding back. And when I watched it in college, I remember just being really blown away by, Ken Russell's visual style, understanding like kind of how the movie really isn't even about all of the words that these intellects are saying during the movie. It's really all about these mind-bending experiences that William Hurt's character has while he's in these deep deprivation chambers and these hallucinations that he's having. And I forget just how accomplished I think Ken Russell is as a director, and his films have so much visual power. And watched it late again. It was like a midnight movie for me this time around, and it woke me up. It's definitely one of those midnight movies that you aren't going to stay asleep on. And I was wide awake for the entire hour and 45-minute experience.
It's interesting because I don't do drugs, but I don't like, this is a movie where I'm like, if I was ever going to try LSD or something like that, or take some acid, like this is definitely a movie I probably would put on, but then I probably would immediately regret it because there's a lot that's going on. And I think what I like about this movie too is that it sort of fits into what I call smarty pants horror movies.
Oh yeah.
Those movies that you, like you said, when you see as a kid, because I think I might have been like 5 or 6 when I saw this movie, which obviously meant nothing to me except that there was just a lot of male butts on the screen. But it's like up there with like Prince of Darkness, where I think it's a movie that rewards upon subsequent viewings because it throws a lot at you. And once you can start to kind of grasp the concepts, I think that's when you sort of find the rewards of it. Because I rewatched it yesterday, and I was like, oh, I was really into it. And then I rewatched it again today, and it I think that almost helped me even more to kind of sort of grasp some of those little rings that they kind of throw at you in terms of like these big ideas. And I like that you mentioned Ken Russell, Monty, because I think this definitely fits into sort of his chasm of films and the stories he likes to tell. But I would argue that even though this movie is pretty heady and it's got a lot of big themes and ideas, it's probably, I would argue, his most commercial movie. which is saying a lot because it's a really bold and unique movie, even by studio standards in 1980. Just looking at the different movies, that we're going to be celebrating for 1980, there's no other movie I think out there that even compares to Altered States.
I completely agree. Like there's so much that is going on, and when you look back at Ken Russell's films that he's come up with, like, yeah, definitely this one definitely is the one that people connect most in terms of its success, more so than like The Devils or Litzomania or any of those other Ken Russell movies.
I also think it's really interesting too because it's, like you said, Heather, it's a movie with a lot of big, heady ideas, but I also think it's very critical of obsessing over big, heady ideas, because that's kind of William Hurt's character, Eddie Jessup. That's really his big push. He's kind of like that Victor Frankenstein character where like he's going to crack the code to like what's the source of truth when it comes to human beings, but that comes at the cost of his relationships. It comes at almost the cost of like his essence entirely. And it doesn't really, if I remember, like if I'm interpreting the ending correctly, when he does really find the answer, it's not a pleasant answer for him. He realizes he's kind of been going down the wrong rabbit hole. So it's interesting that it's a movie that is very intellectual, but it's also like it's a warning about kind of taking that too far at the same time.
Yeah, I would argue it's interesting because I do like that the ending is sort of open interpretations, but ultimately I think it's interesting that it's almost love that I guess saves him or brings him back, which is a very sort of positive ending for a Ken Russell movie, sort of almost uniquely positive, I would say, because there's usually a little bit of nihilism, I would say, in some of Russell's cinematic output. And this, for me, almost is kind of uplifting in a way, because the whole time, you have poor, Blair Brown, who's, I just adore in this movie too. Her Emily, she's madly in love with him. Like you can just, it's palpable. And she's just so disconnected from him because he's so driven by this pursuit of these bigger things and these this sort of parapsychology, like just trying to sort of break these things down in terms of who we are, what our essence is, and ultimately she gets what she's been waiting for. Like the entire movie is that it basically ends with him saying, "I love you." And to me, that was really, as a kid means nothing, but as an adult, you're like, wow, that's, kind of profound that, ultimately in his pursuit of all this greater knowledge and these greater meanings as to what life is, ultimately, is it love? It almost feels like that's what they're saying here. And I thought that was kind of nice and very different, I would say, than a lot of other things that we've seen from Russell as, as a visual storyteller.
Yeah, I think also too the arrogance from her throughout the entire movie and how like supremely more intelligent he is than everybody else around him, and the fact that he's trying to go back for some kind of understanding, but he ends up finding in the end that the understanding and the meaning for him is standing right in front of him. There's that nice little combination of effects at the very end where they're both kind of trying to figure out what's going to keep them together, and not to spoil the ending for this film, it's been around for so long, but there's that great moment of like, love conquers all at the very, which doesn't, you're exactly right, doesn't feel like Ken Russell, but for some strange reason fits like as like the kind of the best ending for this movie, because it doesn't seem like going any other route would make any sense, I guess, in this movie that is very hard to make sense of in the first place.
Yeah, I think what's interesting too, again, when you sort of talk about Blair Brown, who I loved, I don't know, did you guys ever watch The Days and Nights of Molly Dodd when you were younger?
I did not.
Okay.
I have seen just a few episodes, but I have not seen the entire thing.
Okay, I was super obsessed with that show when I was a kid. So it was funny because like, I'd seen this really little and then, kind of grew up watching that in like the late 80s. And I think it ran into like the early 90s. So I didn't put two and two together that this was her until going back and rewatching it. And I was like, oh my gosh. And then I realized like what an accomplished stage actor she had been and everything like that. And I really feel like she is the heart of this movie. I really like, that it is cold and as disconnected as Eddie is throughout a lot of this movie. I mean, he's very engaging to watch, especially, when William Hurt just starts basically like having like diarrhea of like all these grand concepts when he's just like going off about something or other. And it just like, you'll get these like reaction shots from her where she's just like in awe of him, or the way that she looks at him. Like, I'm so glad that she's sort of this emotional anchor, because I don't know that there's enough really to connect with on an emotional level without her in this. And I think that's, it's important to the story, but I think it's ultimately important to who Eddie is too, for as much as he doesn't necessarily see it until the end. And I just think that she gives a really great performance, and it's like, it almost verges on what I call a talkie in our house, because there's a lot of, quick dialogue, people talking over each other and things like that. And I just think that there's something really, really great about her performance in this film in particular. For as great as William Hurt is and the rest of the supporting cast, I think she's sort of this really wonderful sort of beacon of light amongst all this other sort of weirdness that's all around.
And I think without that performance too, it could have been a very thankless job that she's doing, because ultimately this is very much William Hurt's movie. Like, this is about Eddie, this is about his journey, and so like she could have been just kind of like this. The role on paper could possibly be not necessarily a whole lot to it, but yeah, I think you're right that Blair Brown brings something to it that brings it more alive and makes it so that she is kind of the yin to his yang in this story, and for her to be able to bring that out and flesh it out more really helps the movie quite a bit.
Well, and also there's kind of a nice weird balance in what the narrative is kind of searching for, like the complications, the supreme complications and complexities of the origin of life, and the supreme complexities and complications of the origin of love, and how that is kind of balanced on both sides with this one character who is the woman character in the movie, the love interest, and then these intellects who are constantly bickering about, what it is. And in the end, like, that term love is what conquers everything. But in the same realm, like, you could see Eddie maybe having to explore like what the origins of love actually are, and being just as confused about everything in the end,
He's like diving into like Shakespeare sonnets and stuff like that, and still ignoring her completely.
No, absolutely. And I think that's interesting too, because, when you look at a lot of what this movie is about, because it's, it's about like the essence of our humanity. Where does it all start? Where does it end? I think, again, when you're talking about like movies that were going on around this time, like it's interesting. Like, I don't really see a lot of other movies at this point taking these things on. I think we saw a lot that followed in its footsteps. And I think that's really ballsy in a way that this, ended up being like a big Warner Brothers movie. For $1980, they spent almost $20 million on it, which is quite a chunk of change for them to spend on, basically Ken Russell's, I think, first American film, if I'm not mistaken, and taking on somebody who's like an unknown, like William Hurt, because this is his first film, and really just rolling the dice with this material. And I think what's really interesting too, because like, when I was kind of doing research and I realized, this is William Hurt's first role, like, I don't know, I guess I just went growing up, like, I'd always seen him in movies, so I just kind of assumed he was always around. Mm-hmm. What a fantastic debut performance. Like, talk about, like, just completely blowing people away. Like, I was trying to think of, like, other sort of debut performances that I could compare it to, and I came up completely short on that. There's just something really wonderfully manic, charming, but like still calculated. There's just a really interesting energy to how he plays Eddie in this film, and I don't think the movie would have been as successful without him. I was thinking of like who would have come in 1980 to do this, and I'm like, I couldn't figure it out.
Yeah,
It helps too that it's written by Paddy Chayefsky, who did Network, who did Hospital, who did, all of these. He did Manny with Ernest Borgnine way back in the day. I mean, he was a very, very accomplished writer at this time. So the fact that he, supplement his words to this film, I think also probably gave the studio a little bit more confidence, considering he's won, multiple award winner for the screenplays that he's written, that, setting up the success for this movie and setting up, the production company backing them and giving them what they needed for this film, that is so bold and so in your face, that I would say, I would looking at the research of it, I would say it's probably because it had him attached as a writer of the script originally, that it probably gave the studio confidence of like, oh, we can do this because this writer has been around and has won numerous awards for the other movies that he has written.
An interesting part about that is that I was actually doing I went down a little bit of a wiki wormhole on this movie, and apparently Chayefsky and Russell did not get along at all. Chayefsky apparently really liked to have creative control over his scripts, and I guess Russell was just having none of it in some ways. Now, from what I'm hearing, Russell, he left a lot of the words in terms of the dialogue, and he really kept the screenplay as it was, but Chayefsky had a lot of input he wanted to give about lighting and stuff that also kind of seems like it was really nitpicky in some ways, the way they colored the deprivation tank and things like that. It kind of gets into that really interesting conversation about when does it stop being the writer's creation and when does it start being the director's creation, at least in terms of the production of it.
Yeah, and a successful writers too, right? Him coming off of all those Academy Awards, I'm sure that at this point in time he's in that realm of well, I've done this before. I know what works. I know, he's probably wanting to be the director, exactly like what you said.
Yeah, it's interesting because, now that we sort of know, how the studio works and things like that, writers, they submit a script and, a lot of times they'll get to be on set to kind of, input here and there, but they generally don't have a lot of creative control beyond what happens with the script. So the fact that he was sort of nitpicky over technical aspects of the film is kind of interesting to me, because these days, if a writer was just no, this needs to look like this, the producers would be go scratch. They don't care, So it's interesting that, I haven't read the book, although now I'm really curious about it after revisiting this. But from what I've read, it is pretty faithful to the book, which is, again, sort of a rarity when it comes to Ken Russell. So it's interesting that, it just seems like maybe there was two egos at kind of causing a little friction between them, and they just could not get over that, which is really kind of a bummer, because you have, probably one of the greatest screenwriters working with one of the, most visually compelling filmmakers of all time, and they couldn't get past their egos, which is a bit of a bummer. But I mean, ultimately, if you're a writer and the words are still there, I don't know how much else you could be really upset about, other than if there's just something else going on, whether he wanted to direct or not. I mean, it would have been interesting. He, had worked in the industry for decades prior, so it's not like he wouldn't have had the experience. But also, I mean, and I think there's an interesting thing that comes up with these concepts that I almost think happens with Stephen King novels, is you have writers who kind of write for the page, but it's nearly impossible to translate to the screen. And if you look at a lot of the sequences and things like that, the stuff that they were doing on a visual level was really cutting edge for 1980 in terms of the optical effects and things like that. And I don't know how you get a director in there who doesn't really know how to work that kind of stuff. And I think Russell is somebody who did, especially, if you look at something like Tommy, or obviously The Devils and things like that, you needed somebody like him who could go in there and try to almost interpret these impossible images for the screen, because you can write a million things in a book, and you can transport viewers or readers, not viewers, and that's it. You're done. But to then sort of translate it into a screen when you have very, if technology is not there, that's an uphill battle. And I think that's really interesting that, I think this movie really does a lot of things that, again, you weren't seeing in 1980 in terms of film. And again, I just, maybe Paddy would have been an interesting director, to have at the helm. But I just think in terms of the pushing the technology and things like that, I don't know that he would have been the right guy.
And Heather, I think you really hit the nail on the head with that, because part of the sticking point between Chayefsky and between Russell was that Russell, well, I think going back to like when he was writing the novel, Chayefsky, I think already had the movie in mind, because I think he was initially writing this story as a movie, and I think he was convinced to make it into a novel first. So I think in his head he was already visualizing what this would look like as a movie. But I think when Russell kind of was seeing these concepts, he knew from like an experiential point that like, I'm going to need to translate this in a way that someone's going to understand it, because the way it's being described to me now is something that is not going to translate to screen. And so I guess, however it was, Chayefsky could probably see that, and the fact that Russell was trying to, do something with it to make it something translatable, I guess was just a really big sticking point between them.
Men, you and your ego.
It's interesting that you bring up the relationship between the writer and the director. I don't know why, but I immediately thought about how many people tried to adapt Gerald's Game, and how Flanagan came along and was the guy that just understood that writing enough. And I wonder if there's to an extent maybe a part of Russell being like, I can connect with this because I can make parts of that novel come to life in different ways than maybe even the writer was thinking about how it could come to life. And I think that's a really interesting balance, and I love exploring that, especially in film, when we see these grand, these books that may have, many people call it unadaptable, finally find a film and a visual medium to come through, and they end up being so different. And I've had that many times where I've read books and I had that recently with Dr. Sleep. I had read Dr. Sleep and wondered how they were going to put some of these things into film, piece of film language. And when Flanagan was doing some of the stuff that he did with Dr. Sleep, I was blown away. I remember sitting in the movie theater being like, oh, like that's how you do it, or oh, that's what it looks like, or oh, that's what the writer meant. It's so interesting to me, and I love that kind of back and forth that happens with two extremely creative people working in two vastly different mediums.
Yeah.
Go
ahead. I'm sorry, Brian.
Sorry, just to kind of add on that just a little bit. I think what Russell really gets right in terms of translating these visuals, I haven't read the book, so I don't know how, quote unquote accurate it is in terms of what was on the page to what wound up on screen. But what makes this movie so great is that even if you don't necessarily, if you're not keeping up with all of the thematic threads, the visuals are still so interesting that you can just kind of like buckle up and take the ride anyway. Like you don't necessarily have to get it for this to still be an entertaining movie.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's sort of like what I think it would pair well with like Prince of Darkness, where like it throws a lot of things at you, and the first time you're watching, you're like, hold up, slow down, what is going on? You need a little bit to like sort of kind of recalibrate to like these really big concepts. And I think that's for me, like as a kid, like I watched all these movies and they, I enjoyed them or whatever, but as an adult, like I love rediscovering them because I feel like I'm learning all over again. And, when you talk about like physics of, whether it's the physics of evil in Prince of Darkness or sort of the essence of existence, in altered states, I mean, it's really fascinating. Like, I think I figured out that I kind of really like this, like nerdy science horror.
I'm 100% on board. And I actually think that double feature is one that I'm going to do within the next couple of months now, because that sounds like it would be a really interesting, just like it would be a total trip. Like you, I don't do drugs. I think watching those two movies back to back would probably be the closest thing for me to taking psychedelics that I could get.
Yeah, I was thinking double features as well too, and for some reason I kept thinking like day and night double features, where the day feature would be Terrence Malick's Tree of Life, and the night feature would be Altered States, as like a really great pairing of like two creatives trying to explore this meaning that is so complex, and how they're going to do it through visual styles or visual mediums and stuff. And I think it'd be a long experience with Malick's film, but it would be an interesting one.
Yeah, actually, now that because I haven't seen Tree of Life, I think since theaters, I want to say, because I don't think I've seen it since. That would be, I'd be curious to revisit that as a pairing with Altered States. Yeah, that would be kind of interesting. I'm sorry, it sounded like Brian was about to say something.
Oh, nope.
Oh, okay, sorry.
I was gonna say I have a short story about experience with Tree of Life. I watched this in a packed theater opening night, and there were a lot of people from Arizona film community that I knew because only one theater was playing it in town. So we're all there, and there's all these people I know, and it reminded me kind of like for the LA people going to Beyond Fest and seeing all of your movie friends there, right? And I was sitting there watching this movie with a whole bunch of people, and there was this young kid that I knew. He was kind of up and coming in the film community, and he had not seen any Terrence Malick films up to this time. So this of Life was his first experience with a Terrence Malick film. And we sit there through the movie, and it ends, and all these movie guys are standing there, and we're like, well, it's good, but it's not as good as this, or it's we're all talking about Terrence Malick, and this kid comes wandering over, and he literally looks like just shook to his core, and he just didn't know how to explain anything. And it literally took him like 2 weeks before he finally like told us in the movie group like what he was feeling about this movie. And it was such a great like feeling to as somebody who had watched a lot of movies by that time and had seen every Terrence Malick film, but to see like a young person experience something like for the first time, that's what makes me think about Altered States, like a young, maybe experiencing that with somebody who has never experienced that before, but has seen a lot of movies like that. And, maybe even somebody who that might be his first Terrence Malick film. That's kind of my thing to do with movie friends is I'm like, oh, so you've never seen a Terrence Malick film? Well, let me show you this movie. Or you've never seen, a John Carpenter film? Let me show you this one. And it's just such a beautiful experience to see somebody who is, regarded as like a legendary filmmaker or somebody whose visual style is really arresting, to give to somebody who's never seen them before. And there's some kind of power to that. And I think both Terrence Malick's Tree of Life and Ken Russell's Altered States have that quality, that arresting visual element that is just almost overwhelming, at times, like, and it just kind of sticks with you. And I saw the movie 3 nights ago, and even like today I was driving around and I was like, I'm still thinking about it. And it's nuts that was the case. And, that's the power of a film like that, because, I watch lots of movies and sometimes none of them stay. They just go in and go out. But even Altered States, many years after its release, and for a movie buff like me who's been watching a lot of stuff in quarantine, it's still like really had an effect on me. And I was still thinking about it days after it was over.
Absolutely. And I think, we've talked about, Paddy Chayefsky, and we've talked about Ken Russell, but it's really interesting. First of all, I have to correct myself because in the last episode of Corpse Club, I mentioned we were talking about Altered States, and I referenced Rick Baker is doing the effects, which I am completely wrong on that. It is actually the maestro of modern effects, Dick Smith, that did the special effects for this. But it was interesting.
The Godfather.
Yes.
And you got that wrong, Heather. Your books are canceled.
I know. Well, when you're like 70 something interviews and this stuff, everything starts to blend together, and I'm like, I don't know. Everybody worked on everything at this point. But it's interesting because, like, obviously Dick Smith's a legend, and he was doing some pretty cool stuff in this movie. But I want to talk about Bran Farron, who did the visual effects. And originally it was supposed to be John Dykstra, who was going to come in and do the optical effects and all of sort of like the digital stuff, or like the not digital because it wasn't filmed digitally, but like the optical effects and sort of like the visual type elements, especially when Eddie's tripping and all that kind of stuff. Because John Dykstra had come out of Star Wars. He is the guy when like you want to go to the best, you go to John Dykstra. And for some reason, I don't remember if it was when Ken Russell was on, that he was let go, or if it was when the original director, who was Arthur Penn, who originally had, who had previously directed movies like Bonnie and Clyde, and I'm totally blanking on other movies. I just remember I love Bonnie and Clyde. So I was like, oh man, Arthur Penn would have been an interesting choice. But Brian Farren, I didn't realize, because like I've seen his name show up in credits before, but I didn't realize like what kind of a sciencey badass he is in the world of filmmaking, because he is a guy who developed a lot of different technologies for filmmaking, and he worked on Altered States. He worked on one of the Star Trek movies, Little Shop of Horrors. A lot of really interesting things. But he also was the head of R&D for like the creative visual division of Walt Disney, which that's for Imagineering, for the parks and stuff like that. And if you think about how some of those things, especially like if you go through Haunted Mansion, like you're looking at animatronics, but you're also looking at like these 3D images kind of floating through rooms and things like that. Like, I'm really fascinated by this guy. Like, I wish I kind of knew more about him before we came into this episode, because I was reading up on him this morning and I was like, whoa, this guy is like pretty cool, and did some really interesting stuff, and developed a lot of technologies that people still use to today. And so it's interesting to sort of see that he laid the groundwork in Altered States, and here we are 40 years later, and the stuff that he was creating back then is still pretty relevant to certain aspects of filmmaking today.
It is amazing 4 decades later how polished and how much these effects pop off the screen. Like, everything is just like, there are colors in this movie that I don't think I've ever seen before. And just like none of it looks dated. This could be something that they put out this year and it would still look really, really good, even by today's standards.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think like there's a little bit of it that feels dated, but in the way that like you just recognize like today that like, it would be a different palette that somebody would be working with. I love Last Starfighter, but I'll watch that movie and I'll be like, oh, so those were the visual effects that we had in 1984. But I actually think, like, when you look at Altered States, I think there's stuff in Altered States looks better than some of the stuff that followed in its footsteps. And it does some really interesting things, especially like in the finale when Emily and Eddie are sort of in the hallway and she's all like crazy fiery and and he's all kind of flashing and everything like that. I was rewatching, I was like, wow, this is, again, for 1980, like we'd only really had Star Wars at that point that sort of pushed any sort of optical effects. So this is, it's kind of ahead of its time in a lot of ways. And when we were, initially when we were talking about like, movies that we were going to do, I was like, we really should talk about Altered States, because nobody ever talks about this film. And I'm kind of wondering, like, now watching it and seeing, the story and the effects and things like why? Like, this movie was obviously very pivotal, especially to where genre storytelling went following its release, where effects went, following its release, where, Ken Russell's career went after this. I think Paddy was pretty much done. I think this was sort of the tail end of his career. But it's such a fascinating little case study of a movie that I really wish more people talked about.
Which is also interesting, considering like it's a weird combination of it's a movie that everybody seems to have seen or like everybody knows about, but nobody talks about. So it's not that it's like this undiscovered gem from 1980, like it's well known. And it's not that people have forgotten it because they don't like it. It just, for whatever reason, I don't know, because it doesn't maybe have like, there are a lot of like visual influences and things that people took kind of influence from it in terms of just like little bits and pieces. But it might be harder to like, because it is such a heady movie, like it's different than the other, one of the other big movies that came out in 80, Friday the 13th, that spawned a whole slew of a whole decade of movies. Whereas this, it was so unique that it almost like inherently couldn't spawn a lot of offspring, just because like where are you going to take something like Altered States?
Yeah. I would almost argue in a way, I feel like The Fly, David Cronenberg's take on The Fly is almost like his response to this movie, because obviously, science is he's very driven by science in a lot of his movies. And I think it's interesting because you have like the mad scientist, obviously the Frankenstein aspect of he's pushing technology in ways that he shouldn't be, sort of goes through it and kind of comes out sort of broken in certain ways. But the interesting is, like, obviously The Fly ends up becoming a tragedy where this ends up sort of having a positive ending. But I was also thinking of The Fly a lot when I was watching this. I mean, not that I don't ever think about The Fly, like all the time. But I was like, wow, that would also be like another sort of double feature that would be interesting because, it's love could have been enough to save Seth, but it wasn't. But love is ultimately enough to save Eddie Jessup.
And that's really interesting too, because I like this movie and I like The Fly because it delves into that idea of like what makes us us. And then The Fly I think really gets into it kind of by negation in terms of like, is he Seth Brundle anymore? Is he or is he Brundle Fly? Like, is he this completely different thing now? Whereas I think Altered States takes it in the other direction, where it's like, instead of evolving, it's going backwards and seeing like, where did we come from, to the point where you dive too far down that rabbit hole and you become where we came from, and you stop being yourself because you've started to devolve back into the origins. So that wasn't something I had thought of, but now that you mentioned The Fly, I think that is another really good, there's definitely a lot of kind of thematic parallels there.
There's a nice, like, going back kind of a step back to talk about the visual influences of the movie and how it kind of connects to that process of origin that you're talking about, Brian, is like understanding too that the movie is an exploration of something that people don't have an idea of what it looks like, right? We all talk about, like, even when people talk about, having life after death experiences, or being on the table and seeing themselves as they've just died and then brought back, and kind of what that all feels like. I think the visual style that is used and a lot of the visual works that you see in that final ending really work well and really kind of trick your eye, because you're already kind of being pulled into a hallucination, right? Like if the film was based more in reality and in real situations, I think your eye would say to your little, like, oh, that looks fake, or that, that doesn't look real. But because you're slowly kind of pulled into that hallucination with Eddie Jess and all the things that are going on, that your eye almost forgives a little bit. At least mine did at the very end when I see the final transformation scene, where it just really made sense that that's how they would look together in the real world, as opposed to, what they look like in the hallucination. And that's a combination of kind of those two things coming together and trying to find balance, which I feel like a lot of the movie is about as well too, trying to find this balance between the logical and the illogical, or the real and the unreal. Like, they're trying to figure out where that balance and that line is at. I think that really, that visual style accommodates that so well. And and I think that's, when I'm thinking about like why the visual style works so well and still feels so relevant, I think it's in part because how that narrative's set up and how it complements, all of those little elements. And I was even just thinking about it when I was watching it recently, about like how, like, why is it that works? Like, why is it that those effects work? Is it because they're so perfect? And, and to an extent, yeah, they are perfect for that movie. And it really does work in tricking my eye into thinking like, oh, this is exactly how it feels, or this is exactly how it would look. And yeah, that's really got my brain on fire a little bit now thinking about that.
Nice. We're all fired up over here. I also think what's interesting too about this movie is that it also sort of dives into societal constructs of, expectations. A lot of us, it's like you grow up and you're supposed to like graduate from high school, you're supposed to graduate from college, get married, have kids, and you have to find that balance between yourself and like the version of you that serves the rest of humanity. In terms of like your profession and the things that you contribute to society as a whole. And I think this is a really sort of fascinating study of a man who's very conflicted by what he's supposed to do versus what drives him. Because you see during that one scene where it's after him and Emily have been together for a while and he's like, well, I guess we should get married if that's what you want. And then 7 years later, they've got 2 kids and they're on the brink of divorce already. Because he's somebody who really, up until that point, was just kind of doing what Emily had expected of him and what society was expecting of him. But ultimately, he found himself almost at odds with that. You can feel that, especially through William Hurt's performance of this guy who, he talks about I've written all these papers and everything like that, and you want me just to play dad, or something to that degree. And it's interesting because I think it's a really, for a movie that's very big, like high concept and has a lot of crazy sort of grandiose ideas, there's something very relatable to that struggle. And I think that was especially in 1980 as we were sort of seeing the de-evolution of the American family structure. I think that was relatable to a lot of people where, you were told for so long that you were supposed to grow up a certain way and do certain things. And then society sort of changes it a little bit and you're like, well, what am I supposed to still be doing these things when I really want to be doing these other things? I think it asks some really interesting questions about sort of what we're supposed to do, in terms of growing into adulthood and those expectations. And again, I think it sort of comes full circle at the end, when he realizes if I go on this pursuit, it's going to destroy me. Do I want that, or do I want to be back here, with Emily and with this, this world that I know? And I just think there's something really fascinating about that. And I also was really interesting when I was watching it. I realized that his youngest daughter is Drew Barrymore.
There's all kinds of people in this movie.
She's so adorable. I mean, obviously she was adorable in E.T. and stuff, but she's just like a little peanut in this movie, and I just want to hug her. And she's so cute when she's with her little push toy in the house when they get back from Nairobi. I was like, oh my goodness, it's little Drew Barrymore. Which I guess and I realized after I looked it up, this was also her debut feature film as well.
Heather, I think it's so interesting. You talking about the idea of what we do because it's expected of us. Because in that scene where he's talking to Arthur, I believe is his colleague's, his friend, about the fact that they're getting a divorce. I thought that the wording he used was really interesting. And I'm paraphrasing. It's something along the lines of if I have to keep doing this, human everyday ritual stuff, I'm going to lose my mind. And the key word there was ritual, the idea that all of this stuff he's doing by playing family is just because it's kind of like the social contract. He doesn't want to be doing any of this. He wants to be he feels like he's destined for these bigger, more grandiose things. And that he's doing that because he feels a sense of obligation about it is why it's not working. And then, I think at the end, after he kind of, goes through the looking glass with all of this, and he figures out okay, let's try this stuff again, not out of a sense of obligation, but out of something that I can actually enjoy and do it for the sake of doing it, not because I'm being told I have to.
Yeah.
I love that idea, but the ritual is definitely a great term in describing what's happening here, because there is a ritual that he has to go through at one point in the movie in order to, find this drug that's going to make him have a greater understanding of what life is, right? And that ritual, that process that he has to go through in order to get to that point is ritual in the most straightforward term. It's an act of ceremony, an act of ritualistic medicine that they're trying to give to someone to feel better, to have better understanding. And then you have that opposite in the real world, where it's the ritual of love, right? Of being married and being with somebody. Here are just the kind of set in stone things that get you to that point. And it's maybe a little interesting to think that when he does get to realization of what those concepts are, that it's still is equally as confusing as it was before, and that maybe starting over is what he has to do, right? Because he has to go through this ritual of finding out the origins of life, or the origins of his life, or the origins of, you know, what it means to be the origins of humanity, and then gets to this point of like, it's complicated and I'm never going to figure it out, to then figuring out at the end that the origins of love are equally as complicated, and it is a ritual that we all go through, and breaking ritual maybe is what's going to make him find the answers that he's looking for. Yeah. Man, you guys are really making my brain go, I know, we're 1,000 miles a minute right now.
We're going deep today. I also think there's like a really interesting thing when he's talking about his father's death. And he makes this point, which I was like, Jesus, I was like, God, this is right on the money. When he talks about, you know, he basically says something to the effect of like basically the purpose of all of our suffering is just more suffering in the end. And you're like, well, shit, what are we doing here? Like, you know what I mean? Like, is that all what human existence is just suffering? So then ultimately in the end, we're just going to suffer more and die? And I was like, oh God, like, I don't know, maybe now that I'm older and I'm like, you know, now that I'm in my 40s, so it's like, oh my God, what's the rest of my life going to be like now? I mean, it really made me question some stuff where I was like, oh, Jesus. But I think that's a really profound idea. Like, you know, ultimately, I think anybody's goal in life is to be happy or to find happiness. But there's always going to be that conflict that's going to prevent us from being truly happy. You know, for as perfect as things can be, there's always going to be something. And I think it brings up this great idea, like, what are we here for then? Are we just here to suffer? Like, what is that existence then? And I think it's really interesting because I don't know that we necessarily get the answer to that, but I'm okay with it because I like, you know, thinking about it, as depressing as that is. I think it gives, you know, for as deep as this movie goes, it provides some answers, but I also ultimately think that it really is a movie where you walk away with it for maybe with more questions. But in this instance, I think that's a good thing.
And I think that's kind of where they're getting at with the ending. It's the idea of like, we're probably not going to get a lot of ultimate answers. So we need to figure out how to be happy without them. And be able to leave some things up in the air and still be able to get something out of life if we don't have it all figured out, because odds are we're not going to.
Well, and also too, I think, you know, going back to Heather's concept or conversation about the suffering, you know, that they talk about in the movie, it really does make it timely, you know, in today's world when people are dying from COVID-19, where you almost wonder, like, would COVID-19 be as scary as if people said, you know, what's the worst part about COVID is that when you die, you actually are in this happy state of euphoria and you actually can take a full deep breath and things aren't so bad. But because COVID-19, when you die, is you're basically drowning and you're basically can't take a good breath and your life has gone into that exact element of suffering, right? Like, there is something to be said about the relationship of death that people have. And if you witness a traumatic experience with a loved one dying, it's going to make it that much more terrifying to have a relationship with death in the end, that we all are looking for a peaceful death or something that isn't going to hurt or be painful. And even more so when you think about what this movie is exploring on numerous levels, which we talk about love and humanity, and now also maybe the essence of the afterlife as well too, that is kind of going on in these moments, and not wanting to lose people that you love and not wanting to lose them in terrible ways either. It really does make this movie have a greater emotional effect now that we are sitting in our homes contemplating whether or not we're going to get this terrible virus that could lead to some immense suffering. And that's a scary thing. And it makes it, maybe that's why we're all feeling this movie so much more now than we were years ago, is because we're feeling this idea of what, you know, the movie's trying to talk about. You know, we have to have a relationship with death, and we have to have a relationship with what our life is going to look like if we do get sick. Man, did I just bring the whole podcast down?
Not at all. Not at all. I think you've tapped into something with that too, because it's part of what makes this movie so accessible is that it's not too abstract. Like it's not playing with, like it's not expressionism or something where it's just like you need to pick out all these symbols to figure out what's going on. Like, you know why Eddie is the way he is because a lot of this has to do with the trauma of losing his dad. So it's not like they're not talking just in theoreticals. In fact, most of this movie is taking a theoretical and making it into like a practical reality, which is, I think, what makes it so interesting. And yeah, part of that, like you're saying, Monty, is the suffering of it. And there's, no small amount of suffering in this movie, in both kind of like existential and also kind of very real physical ways. So yeah, I think that's definitely speaking to what we have going on now. And I think the fact that, again, it doesn't offer any definitive answers is, it's kind of what we're dealing with now. We don't really have any answers as to what this is going to look like on the other end of it. So it's, try and figure out, find the people or the things that you love, because that's kind of what you got right now.
Yeah, I would argue that there's parts of this movie that I think the reason it does feel accessible, despite some of the things that it throws at you, is that it does sort of tap into these, again, big concepts, but ultimately distills them in a way that is very reflective of like American cinema. And one of the movies I was thinking about, like when I was watching it, is, in a way is like 2001. I also think Alien is another interesting sort of parallel in terms of this idea of life and what it's the value of it and things like that. I know you mentioned the Aha video, which I totally thought of too, because to me it's like, I think that's what's the trademark of like a really great story, is that it can be this completely singular thing. And again, like, as I mentioned earlier, like, look at the movies that came out in 1980. There's nothing like Altered States, but ultimately, if you look at what followed, like, there's a lot of different things out there that, like, you're like, oh, I can kind of see some influences of this movie. And again, when I was watching this, I was kind of thinking of 2001, because it, that's another movie that just sort of really asks big questions. But I would ultimately, and maybe this will get me like a lot of boos and hisses from sort of film community, but like I probably would watch this over 2001, because I don't know that I feel like it comes together in a cinematically satisfying way. I don't even know if that makes sense. But there's a lot of disconnect that I've always had with 2001. I respect the hell out of it. Obviously Kubrick was doing something that, is truly a masterpiece. But as a viewer, I've always felt a disconnect from it. And I think because of some of these sort of American cinematic influences that you feel in Altered States, I think maybe that's why this clung to me a little bit more, because it felt like something I could relate to a little bit more.
So, Heather, I'm going to give a truly American hot take, and I'm going to give an opinion based off of a movie I haven't seen. I haven't actually seen 2001: A Space Odyssey, okay. But I will say that, from like the different clips, because obviously, that's kind of in the cultural zeitgeist, so there's all kinds of clips going around that everybody has seen of 2001. I definitely was getting flashes of that in Altered States, just in terms of like the different trippy visuals and things like that. But knowing what I know about Kubrick and his tendency to lean towards being extremely technically proficient, but kind of draining all the warmth out of material. And spoiler alert, there's going to be some talk about that in the piece that I've got coming up in Class of 80. I'm fairly confident to say that I would probably appreciate Altered States more than I would 2001: A Space Odyssey. And yes, I know I'm saying that not having seen 2001: A Space Odyssey, but like what I really love about Altered States is that it, like, you get the best of both worlds. Like it's taking on these really big ideas, but you don't lose the emotional core out of it by doing all of that. And I can only assume that no, like having seen the Kubrick the Kubrick films that I have seen, that's probably not going to be the case for 2001.
Are you silently judging us now, Monty?
I am a 2001 fanatic.
Okay.
So, but
you can
I
sit here and make some sense out of us now.
But the funny part is, I still agree with you significantly, Heather, about your idea about the accessibility of these films. And I think 2001 is an experience movie. It's definitely one of those movies that it doesn't have such an emotional quality to it. There is emotion there, but it really is an experience. Where I feel like Altered States is more of an emotional experience, where you're kind of forced to be in these hallucinations with Eddie Jessup's character and feel the different emotions he's feeling throughout the movie. And sometimes it's a mix of fear, it's a mix of happiness. There's even distress in some moments. And on the other part, where 2001 feels like experiences, it feels very much like 2001 is showing you this idea that somebody has of what this environment looks like, where Altered State feels like it's somebody trying to make sense of those ideas and give you examples of how you may feel about some of those things as well too. And when you get that emotional quality kind of built in there, I think the accessibility is always different. And I know a lot of people who don't care for 2001 the same way I do. But it's interesting that that I have such a connection to 2001, and maybe it's time. Maybe it's because the first time I watched that movie was in a gigantic theater with people who loved it as well too. I don't know, but I do agree with you, the fact that Altered States definitely has a different kind of quality than what 2001 has in terms of how film fans will connect with it. I like them both very much. I mean, I'm still a 2001. I watch that movie probably once every few years and connect with it differently. But now I feel like after my recent watch with Altered States, that maybe now I'm old enough to kind of get a better understanding of some of the emotions that they're trying to connect with that movie, where it might be something that I revisit more consistently because I can engage with the emotions of that movie better than I could before, where 2001 always felt like an experience, like I was experiencing this new idea of what this world looked like, or this new idea of what storytelling was, or this new idea of what filmmaking was like, or maybe even an idea of who this well-regarded filmmaker named Stanley Kubrick, is, and his body of work. But yeah, I think I wouldn't say you're wrong about how you feel about the movie. I actually think that there's a lot to dissect in that as well too, even more, where maybe Altered States versus 2001 should be maybe a sit down and get 3 people who love that one and 3 people who love Altered States and just have them fight it out, because I think there's going to be interesting concepts that are going to be brought up across the board with that.
Yeah, no, that's like a 6-hour podcast right there, I think. In terms of just trying to dive into, I mean, actually, just even 2001 by itself, like, I don't think that's even a quick conversation at all.
No way.
And like I said, I respect the hell out of it. And it's one that, like, I haven't seen probably in at least 10 years, so I'm kind of due to revisit it, and I'll probably see it through fresh eyes now. But yeah, I do think there's a little more accessibility. But I'm curious, we're 40 years removed from Altered States. Kind of surprised we don't have a remake of this, because it was somewhat of a success for Warner Brothers, and I'm shocked that they haven't sort of dove back into that well. So I'm curious, if you're, present day, you're going to remake Altered States, who is your director?
I think immediately I think of like a Guillermo del Toro, maybe. I think what he does in terms of character and what he could with William Hurt's character would be really, really interesting. I don't know if the visuals would be as spot on as what they have now. That's the hard part, I think, is trying to figure out what the visual palette and the visual style would look like today with the abundance of technology that we have now. There is a quality that Ken Russell had, with him being such a, extravagant filmmaker, that I think is hard to achieve by other filmmakers. And there's something so unique about his perspective. But, I think what Guillermo does with characters would be really interesting, and to see him maybe take the monstrous qualities that he puts into some of his creatures in his movie and add those qualities into a human, which I think William Hurt's character and his arrogance is very much a monster. I think that would be interesting. I don't know.
All right.
I think it would be interesting. For some reason, the first name that popped into my head when you asked that question would be Karen Kusama.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I think what she did with talking about kind of exploring grief in The Invitation, I think kind of taking the traumatic thread for Eddie Jessup's character and kind of exploring that as kind of the influence for his kind of obsessive need to kind of figure out the truth of us as a whole, I think would be interesting. I also think it would be interesting because I think Karen Kusama would be someone, because I was actually thinking about if this was going to get remade, I think one of the things I think would be interesting would be to gender swap the two main roles. So like have Eddie be a woman and have Blair Brown's character be a man, just because I do think there was a certain element of it definitely kind of fell into some tropes from 1980 with kind of the man being the push for reason and kind of science, and the woman kind of being the emotional core and the push for love. So I think it'd be interesting to shake that up a little bit and play that from different gender angles.
Interesting.
How about this? How about you take the film from the perspective of the woman, of the love interest, and have her just watch the de-evolution of her husband.
Oh, so kind of do like the Invisible Man, like kind of like do Lee Winnell's Invisible Man version of this.
Yeah, because then you don't have to depend on the visual style, but you would get that visual punch at the very end when she goes through her transformation, and that way you don't have to emulate what Ken Russell was trying to do, right?
Yeah,
like you can get to this point at the very end where you can give that real big emotional hallucinatory scene to the woman in the final minutes of the movie after she is contemplating what it all means for her husband. That could be a nice little turn too.
That's interesting.
Yeah, my choice would be Panos Cosmatos.
You won. You're right.
When
we're done.
With Beyond the Black Rainbow and Mandy, I think both. I think he's proved that he can kind of place both sides of the coin. I think with these ideas, it's interesting because everybody, because Mandy was so popular amongst us like horror nerds, like he's sort of the answer for everything. I think when people are like, oh, who would you have remake this? Oh, Panos, because he's a guy we want to see working on some crazy stuff. But when I was watching this movie and thinking about Beyond the Black Rainbow specifically, I was like, wow, could you imagine what he could do with a good solid $20 million budget today, with technology being what it is, and thinking about like the visuals that he was able to evoke in Mandy? Like, I got really excited. So as soon as we're done here, I'm actually going to pitch this over to Warner Brothers and be like, you guys probably haven't been thinking about this, but just make this happen. Because I think he would be like the perfect choice to do something like this. And I think, he's proven, through those two films that if there's anybody that could really, I think he would even make it trippier than Ken Russell did. I think that he could actually push things on sort of that visual spectrum of what, those experiences that Eddie goes through in a grander, more even crazier way than we see in this version. So he would be my choice.
And can you imagine Panos' version, which would probably be more wordless than this movie, where we're just watching two people duke it out basically and figure it out? I mean, that would be that's a really, really interesting concept to think about, because Panos' films are notoriously almost wordless at times, where especially Beyond the Black Rainbow, which, pretty much for the entire movie is a silent film. That would be a really interesting take on Altered States. You don't have the science mumbo jumbo or any of that kind of, high intellect conversation. You just have two people dealing with science and these theories in very unique ways. I'm sold. I already bought my ticket. I'm ready to go.
Well, I'm going to go work on my pitch now. I'm sure, I don't know if he's busy or not, but I'm going to make him clear his calendar because now I want nothing more than to see his take on altered states.
And basically, like, the perfect role for Nicolas Cage is when he reverts back to a caveman. That's when Nicolas Cage comes in. Like, he will play the caveman.
I love it. Although he's a little too
perfect.
tall maybe for the caveman.
He can act short. I'm sure he'll figure it out.
He'll figure it out. He's Nicolas Cage. He's a chameleon. He's got this.
And
Awesome,
in the trailer, all you show is Nicolas Cage as a monkey and just say altered states. That's the whole trailer, is just Nicolas Cage being a Neanderthal man, right? Going back in time.
For like 2.5 minutes.
That's it. And then at the very end of that long 2.5 minute trailer, you just see altered states.
Sold. We're all in now.
Can you imagine the gasp in the genre horror world of people? I would send it to all my favorite horror people and say, we want you to do a reaction video to this new trailer coming out by Panos. And, we just want you to react to it and just have them hold that altered states banner until the very end. The title comes up. That would be an amazing experience to see everybody just completely go bonkers when they see it say altered state at the end.
Love it. I love everything about it. Awesome, guys. Is there anything else that you have to add about altered states before we wrap up today?
Only that I was probably more excited than I should have been when I noticed that John Larroquette is in it,
yes,
and B, Commandant Lassard from Police Academy is in it very, very briefly.
I got really excited when Bob Balaban showed up because he's such a good character actor. But I was like, oh my God, it's Phoebe Buffay's dad.
That was the exact thing I was going to say. I was like, Bob Balaban, we haven't talked about him yet.
He's great. He's always great in everything. But I was just one of those. I was like, of course. Literally, I break down his glorious resume down to he plays Frank Buffet on one episode of Friends. So keeping my cinephile status firmly in check, I suppose. But no, guys, I'm really glad we got to do this today. I had a lot of fun sort of breaking down altered states, and I'm hoping for anybody out there who's listening who hasn't seen it, if you do live in the U.S., I know on Vudu you can stream it right now free with ads, and I'd recommend doing that. It's a really good transfer that's on there, because I don't know exactly how accessible the DVDs are, and I don't even know if it's gotten a Blu-ray. It might have at this point. I don't remember.
It does have a Blu-ray. That's what I watched it on. Was a really, really great Blu-ray. Nice upgraded quality. Really good.
Good.
Really good transfer.
Fantastic.
And I think you can still get it pretty cheap. I want to say it's like under $20 or something like that on Amazon.
Oh, perfect. Physical media forever, of course. But for those of you who may not want to spend the money just in case, if you're not quite sure about the head trippiness of it, it is on Vudu. I do recommend it. It's certainly well worth a watch for a variety of reasons that we discussed earlier. But Monte and Bryan, I really do appreciate you being a part of this episode and taking this nice little mind-bendy journey with me today.
Thank you. It was a trip.
Yeah, literally.
Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
Excellent, guys. And for all of you listening, of course, thank you so much for supporting Corpse Club. To find out more about how you can join the Corpse Club, you can visit us over at corpseclub.com. We're on Twitter over at Corpse Club. And for all of your news, reviews, and interviews, you can head over to dailydead.com, where we bring you new content every day. And we will also, starting on Monday, July 6th, we will be rolling out our Class of 1980 written coverage. So I do recommend that you come over to Daily Dead and start checking out all of our different features that we're going to be posting every single day for a few weeks. And we will also be having more podcast episodes as well, where we dive into different films from 1980. And I would be remiss if I didn't say thank you to our engineer, Bryan, for always making us sound great. And until next time, everybody, stay scary.